The sun hit the asphalt like a hammer. By 9 in the morning, the temperature in Atlanta had already climbed past 85 degrees, and the air above Interstate 85 shimmered with heat waves that made distant vehicles look like mirages floating on a river of light. Lieutenant Sarah Collins stood beside her unmarked cruiser, one hand shielding her eyes from the glare, the other resting on the lead attached to her partner. Max sat perfectly still at her heel, his ears rotating like satellite dishes, catching sounds that human ears would never register. His coat gleamed almost bronze in the harsh morning sun, and his amber eyes tracked every vehicle that slowed for the checkpoint ahead. This was Operation Clean Sweep, a multi-agency initiative targeting drug trafficking corridors through the metropolitan area. Sarah had been assigned to the secondary checkpoint on the northbound lanes, a position that caught vehicles after they had already passed the primary stop and believed themselves to be clear. It was a psychological trick that worked more often than anyone would expect. Smugglers who white-knuckled their way through the first checkpoint would relax just enough to make a mistake at the second one. A nervous glance, a window that stayed up a half-second too long, a trunk that popped with just a little too much hesitation. Sarah had been working these operations for 3 years now, and Max had been beside her for every single one. The Belgian Malinois had an almost supernatural ability to detect concealed substances, but more than that, he had an instinct for human behavior that sometimes unnerved even his handler. He could sense fear, deception, the chemical signature of guilt that seeped through human pores like invisible ink. Sarah had learned to trust that instinct completely. When Max reacted, she paid attention. When Max went still, she held her breath. The morning traffic had been light so far. A few commercial trucks, a handful of early commuters, a motorcycle club heading to some weekend rally. Nothing had triggered Max beyond a mild interest in a delivery van carrying what turned out to be perfectly legal shipments of cured meats. The dog had been disappointed when that particular search yielded nothing more exciting than salami. Sarah checked her watch. The operation was scheduled to run until noon, and she was already sweating through her uniform shirt. The dark blue fabric of her Atlanta PD uniform absorbed the heat like a sponge, and she could feel moisture pooling at the small of her back. She reached down and scratched behind Max's ears, a gesture that was as much for her own comfort as for his. That was when she saw the bus. It emerged from the heat shimmer like a white whale breaching the surface of a troubled sea. A full-sized charter coach, gleaming and clean, with tinted windows that reflected the morning sky like mirrors. As it slowed for the checkpoint, Sarah could see the church logo painted on the side in flowing gold script, Harvest of Grace Community Church, with a stylized cross and wheat sheaf beneath the name. The destination placard above the windshield read, Stone Mountain Park, a church group, Sunday morning, heading to a picnic or a retreat or whatever it was that church groups did on beautiful summer days. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. These stops were usually the easiest. Cooperative passengers, legitimate purposes, nothing to hide but perhaps a few too many deviled eggs in the cooler. The bus rolled to a stop at the checkpoint, and Sarah watched as Officer Darnell Washington approached the driver's window. Washington was a 15-year veteran with a calm demeanor that put nervous drivers at ease. He would handle the initial contact, check documents, ask the standard questions. Sarah and Max would conduct the exterior sweep, a routine precaution that rarely yielded anything of interest. She gave Max the signal to move, and they began their slow circuit of the vehicle. The dog's nose twitched as they passed the front wheel wells, cataloguing the scent of hot rubber and brake dust. They moved along the passenger side, where Sarah could see faces pressed against the tinted windows, watching them with the mild curiosity of people who had nothing to fear. Most of the passengers appeared to be middle-aged or older, dressed in matching light blue T-shirts with the church logo. She could see smiles, waves, a few people holding up their phones to take pictures of the handsome police dog. Max showed no interest in the passenger compartment. His pace remained steady, his breathing even, his body language relaxed but alert. They rounded the rear of the bus, passing the emergency exit and the large luggage compartments that ran along the lower portion of the vehicle. Sarah was already thinking about the next vehicle in line, a white panel van that looked like it might warrant closer attention. Then Max stopped. It was not a gradual slowing, not a hesitation, not even a pause. It was a complete and total cessation of movement, as if someone had pressed a pause button on reality itself. The dog's body went rigid, every muscle locked in place. His nose pointed directly at the rear luggage compartment like a compass needle finding true north. His ears flattened against his skull, and a low sound emerged from his throat, something between a whine and a growl that Sarah had only heard a handful of times in their partnership. She felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Max had been trained to give a passive alert, to sit and stare when he detected the presence of narcotics. This was something different. This was something that had triggered a response Sarah had only seen once before, during a raid on a warehouse that had yielded enough fentanyl to kill half the population of Georgia. This was Max telling her that whatever was in that compartment was not just illegal, it was dangerous. Sarah keyed her radio with a steady hand, keeping her voice low and calm. "Dispatch, this is K-9 Unit 7. I have a strong alert on a charter bus at Checkpoint 2, requesting additional units and authorization to search." The response came back within seconds, crackling through the humid air. "Copy that, K-9-7. Units en route. You are authorized to proceed." She approached the bus driver's window, where Officer Washington was still reviewing paperwork. The driver was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with a friendly face and a Georgia Bulldog's cap. He looked confused when Sarah appeared at his elbow, but not concerned. "Not yet." "Sir, I need you to step off the bus and open the rear luggage compartment," Sarah said, keeping her voice professional and neutral. "My dog has indicated something that requires further inspection." The driver's eyebrows rose. "The luggage compartment?" "Ma'am, there's nothing down there but suitcases and picnic supplies. We're just a church group heading to Stone Mountain for our annual retreat." "I understand, sir. This is routine procedure. Please step off the bus." The driver complied, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who genuinely believed there had been a mistake. He led Sarah and Max to the rear of the vehicle, fumbling with a large ring of keys, until he found the one that unlocked the luggage compartment. The metal door swung upward with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a neatly packed space filled with coolers, folding chairs, canvas bags, and standard travel luggage. Max lunged forward, straining against his lead, his nose working furiously. He bypassed the coolers, ignored the folding chairs, and drove straight toward a large black duffel bag, wedged between two hard-sided suitcases near the back of the compartment. His paws scrabbled against the metal floor as he tried to reach it, and Sarah had to use both hands to hold him back. "Whose bag is this?" she asked the driver. The man peered into the compartment, squinting against the shadows. "That one. I think that belongs to Harold Demming. He's one of our deacons, been with the church for, must be 15 years now. He's the chaperone for this trip. I need to speak with Mr. Demming. Please ask him to step off the bus." The driver hesitated, clearly troubled by the direction this stop had taken. "Ma'am, Harold is one of the most respected men in our congregation. I'm sure whatever your dog thinks he smells, there's been some kind of mistake. Sir, I need you to bring Mr. Demming to me now." Something in Sarah's voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because the driver nodded and climbed back onto the bus without further argument. Through the tinted windows, Sarah could see movement, heads turning, people craning to see what was happening outside. A few moments later, a man appeared at the top of the bus steps and began to descend. Harold Demming was 52 years old, according to the driver's license he would later produce. He was tall and thin, with silver hair combed neatly back from a high forehead and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the look of an accountant or a professor. He wore the same light blue church t-shirt as the other passengers, tucked neatly into khaki pants, and he carried a leather-bound Bible in his left hand. His face wore an expression of polite confusion as he approached Sarah, but his eyes told a different story. Behind those wire-rimmed lenses, Sarah saw something flicker and die. Recognition, calculation, fear. "Officer," Harold said, extending his right hand in greeting, "I understand there's some kind of problem with the luggage." Sarah did not take his hand. "Mr. Demming, my K-9 partner, has indicated the presence of contraband in a bag that I'm told belongs to you. I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to consent to a search of that bag." Harold's smile remained fixed in place, but the corners tightened almost imperceptibly. "Contraband? Officer, I can assure you there's nothing illegal in my belongings. I packed that bag myself this morning. It contains clothes, toiletries, and some materials for our Bible study sessions. Then you won't mind if we take a look." A pause. The smile flickered. "Of course not. I have nothing to hide." Sarah studied his face, looking for the tells that years of experience had taught her to recognize. The micro-expressions that betrayed deception. The asymmetric movements that indicated rehearsed responses. Harold Demming's face was a mask of calm cooperation, but his hands were not quite steady as he reached up to adjust his glasses, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on his upper lip that had not been there moments before. By this time, 2 additional patrol units had arrived at the checkpoint, and the area around the bus had been cordoned off with traffic cones. The other passengers remained on board, their faces pressed against the windows, watching the drama unfold with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Sarah could hear murmurs of prayer drifting through an open window, soft voices asking for guidance and protection. She pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves and approached the luggage compartment, where the black duffel bag waited like a malevolent presence among the innocent coolers and suitcases. Max had calmed somewhat, but he remained fixated on the bag, his eyes never leaving it, his body trembling with barely contained energy. Whatever was inside, he wanted it found. Sarah unzipped the bag. The first layer was exactly what Harold had described. Neatly folded clothes, a toiletry kit, a leather journal, a Bible study guide, normal items for a weekend retreat, but the bag was heavier than it should have been, and the bottom seemed too high, too rigid. Sarah pressed down on the false bottom and felt it give slightly under her fingers. She found the hidden zipper along the interior seam and pulled it open, revealing a second compartment that had been professionally concealed beneath the first. The contents of that compartment would later be inventoried and catalogued, photographed and weighed, analyzed and documented according to strict evidentiary procedures. But in that moment, standing in the brutal August sun, with sweat dripping into her eyes, Sarah Collins could only stare at what the false bottom had revealed. Plastic-wrapped bricks of white powder stacked as neatly as library books. Dozens of them, filling the hidden compartment from edge to edge. Based on size and weight, Sarah estimated she was looking at somewhere between 15 and 20 kilograms of what was almost certainly cocaine, with a street value in the millions. Harold Demming, deacon of Harvest of Grace Community Church, chaperone of the Stone Mountain Retreat, respected member of the congregation for 15 years, stood in the bright morning sunlight and watched his carefully constructed world come apart at the seams. "Mr. Demming," Sarah said, reaching for her handcuffs, "you are under arrest for possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute." The mask finally cracked. Harold's face went through a rapid series of transformations, from shock to denial to rage to something that looked almost like relief. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment Sarah thought he might collapse right there on the asphalt. But then he drew himself up. and his eyes met hers with an expression she had not expected. Not defeat, not resignation, warning. "You don't know what you've done," he said quietly, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "You don't know what you've started." The words hung in the humid air like a prophecy, and Sarah felt a cold finger trace its way down her spine, despite the oppressive heat. She had made thousands of arrests in her career, and she had learned to tune out the threats and the promises and the desperate bargaining that accompanied most of them. But there was something in Harold Demming's voice that made her pause, something that told her this arrest was not an ending. It was a beginning. The precinct was chaos by the time Sarah arrived with her prisoner. Word had spread through the department like wildfire, and every officer who could find an excuse had gathered to catch a glimpse of the church deacon who had been caught with 20 kilos of cocaine in his Sunday school bag. Captain Marcus Webb met Sarah at the booking desk, his dark face creased with a combination of satisfaction and concern that she had come to recognize over the years. "Hell of a catch, Collins," he said, falling into step beside her as she walked Harold toward the interrogation rooms. "The commissioner's already called twice. Wants a full briefing as soon as we have something solid." "We'll have plenty," Sarah replied. "This isn't some small-time runner." The way that compartment was constructed, the quantity involved, the logistics of moving that much product through a church group. This guy's connected to something bigger. Webb nodded slowly. "That's what worries me. You don't move 20 kilos without serious backing, and you don't hide it in a church bus unless you're very confident or very desperate. Maybe both." They reached interrogation room 3. A windowless box with institutional green walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. Sarah handed Harold off to Officer Washington, who would handle the formal booking procedures, and stepped into the observation room adjacent to the interrogation space. Through the one-way glass, she watched as her prisoner was seated and secured, his wrists attached to a restraining bolt in the center of the table. Captain Webb joined her a moment later, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the break room. Sarah accepted one gratefully, wrapping her hands around the styrofoam despite the heat. The air conditioning in the observation room was working overtime, and after hours in the August sun, the chill was welcome. "What do we know about him?" Webb asked, nodding toward the glass. Sarah consulted the notes she had compiled during the drive from the checkpoint. Harold Eugene Demming, age 52, born in Macon, raised in Atlanta. No criminal record whatsoever. Not even a parking ticket. He's been a member of Harvest of Grace for 18 years, ordained as a deacon for the past 15. Married for 23 years to a woman named Eleanor, 2 adult children, both living out of state. He owns a small accounting firm with offices downtown, handles taxes and bookkeeping for small businesses. Everything about his life screams boring, respectable, middle-class American, which makes him either the perfect cover or the world's unluckiest patsy. My money's on option 1. You should have seen his face when I opened that bag. He knew exactly what was in there. And what he said to me right before I put him in the car. What did he say? That I don't know what I've started. Webb's eyebrows rose. That sounds like a man who's worried about something bigger than a drug charge. Sarah took a long sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving the figure slumped in the interrogation room. Harold Demming had asked for a lawyer immediately upon arrival at the precinct, which meant they were limited in what questions they could ask until counsel arrived. But she could still watch, she could still observe. And what she observed was a man who seemed to be engaged in some kind of internal debate, his lips moving silently, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table in front of him. "He's calculating," Sarah said, trying to figure out his options, wondering who he can trust and who he needs to protect, or who he needs to throw under the bus, Webb added. 20 kilos is enough to trigger federal trafficking charges. He's looking at a minimum of 10 years, probably more. If he's got information that could reduce that sentence, he might be willing to deal, Let's see how loyal he is to his friends once his lawyer explains the math. The lawyer arrived 45 minutes later. A sharp-faced woman in her 40s named Victoria Ashworth, who moved through the precinct with the confidence of someone who had been there many times before. She spent 30 minutes in private consultation with her client before emerging to inform Captain Webb that Mr. Demming was prepared to make a statement. Sarah took her place across the table from Harold, with Officer Washington manning the recording equipment in the corner. The deacon looked different now. The polite confusion was gone, replaced by a calculating wariness that seemed far more authentic. His lawyer sat beside him, a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten notes balanced on her knee. "Mr. Demming," Sarah began, "you have been advised of your rights and have chosen to make a statement in the presence of your attorney. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand the seriousness of your situation. The substance found in your possession has been field-tested and confirmed as cocaine. The quantity involved elevates this to a first-degree felony with mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. Do you understand?" Harold nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good. Then let's start with a simple question. Where did the cocaine come from?" A long pause. Harold glanced at his lawyer, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I was given the bag this morning," he said, "at my home, around 6:30. A man came to my door, handed me the duffel, and told me to put it in the luggage compartment of the church bus. He said someone would collect it at Stone Mountain. Who was this man? I don't know his name. I've never seen him before. He was Hispanic, medium height, with a scar on his left cheek. That's all I can tell you." Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Demming, you're asking me to believe that a stranger appeared at your door this morning, handed you a bag full of cocaine, and you simply did what he asked without question? That doesn't match the behavior of a man with no criminal history and 18 years of faithful church service." Harold's jaw tightened. "What I'm telling you is the truth. Then explain this. The hidden compartment in that bag was professionally constructed. Custom work, probably done by a specialist. That's not something you put together in an afternoon. It's not something a random stranger would hand to an accountant from Atlanta unless there was already an established relationship. So I'll ask you again. Where did the cocaine come from?" The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Sarah could see the conflict playing out on Harold's face. The competing impulses of self-preservation and something else. Fear, she realized. Not fear of her, not fear of prison, but fear of something else entirely. Someone else. "There's a network," Harold said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A distribution network that operates throughout the Southeast. They use legitimate businesses as fronts, churches, charities, organizations that nobody would think to investigate. They've been moving product through Harvest of Grace for almost 10 years. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. 10 years. And you've been part of this for how long? 8 years. I was recruited by someone in the congregation, someone I trusted. At first it was small things. Helping to move money, keeping records off the books. But it grew. It always grows, and once you're in, you don't get out. Who recruited you?" Harold shook his head. "I can't tell you that. Can't or won't. Both. You don't understand how these people operate. They have eyes everywhere. They have people in places you wouldn't believe. If I give you names, if I start pointing fingers, I'm a dead man. My wife is a dead woman. My children, my grandchildren, everyone I've ever loved becomes a target." Sarah sat back in her chair, considering her options. Harold Demming was clearly terrified, and that terror was genuine. Whatever organization he had become involved with, it had the power to inspire the kind of fear that transcended even the threat of federal prison. That told her she was dealing with something far larger than a simple drug distribution ring. "Mr. Demming," she said carefully, "I understand your concerns. I understand that you believe yourself to be in danger, but right now you're facing charges that could put you in prison for the rest of your life. The only way to reduce that sentence is to cooperate with this investigation. If you can give us actionable intelligence, names, locations, methods of operation, the district attorney may be willing to recommend leniency. But you have to give us something. Harold looked at his lawyer, then back at Sarah. His hands were trembling again, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air of the interrogation room. "There's a shipment," he said, "a big one, coming through the port of Savannah in 3 days. I don't know the exact details, but I know it's worth tens of millions, and I know who's coordinating it on this end." Sarah leaned forward. "Who?" A name, spoken so quietly that the recording equipment barely caught it. A name that made Sarah's blood run cold. Judge Raymond Pierce. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Sarah heard Officer Washington's sharp intake of breath from the corner, heard the scratch of Victoria Ashworth's pen as she made a rapid notation on her legal pad. But her eyes never left Harold Demming's face, searching for any sign that this was a fabrication, a desperate gambit by a man trying to deflect attention from his own crimes. She found nothing but conviction and fear. "Judge Pierce," Sarah repeated carefully. "Raymond Pierce of the Fulton County Superior Court." Harold nodded. "He's been involved for at least as long as I have. Maybe longer. He handles the legal side, makes sure that cases get dismissed or reduced, makes sure that the right people stay out of prison. In return, he gets a percentage of everything that moves through his jurisdiction." "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Demming. Judge Pierce has been on the bench for over 20 years. He has an impeccable reputation. His reputation is manufactured. Everything about him is manufactured. He's a monster wearing the mask of a saint, and he's been getting away with it because nobody would ever believe the truth." Harold's voice cracked, and for the first time, Sarah saw the man beneath the mask, a frightened, desperate, broken man who had made a series of terrible choices and was now watching the consequences close in around him. "I've seen things, Lieutenant. I've helped hide things. And every time I thought about coming forward, I remembered what happened to the others, the ones who tried to get out, the ones who thought they could make deals with the police. What happened to them? They disappeared, not arrested, not charged, just gone, like they never existed at all." Sarah absorbed this information, her mind racing through the implications. If Harold was telling the truth, if Judge Raymond Pierce was indeed part of a major drug trafficking operation, then this case had just become exponentially more complicated and exponentially more dangerous. She ended the interrogation shortly afterward, citing the need to verify Harold's claims before proceeding further. In truth, she needed time to think, time to plan, time to figure out how to investigate a sitting judge without tipping him off that he was under suspicion. Captain Webb was waiting for her in the observation room, his face grave. "I heard every word," he said. "If even half of what Demming says is true, we're looking at the biggest corruption case this department has ever seen." "And the most dangerous," Sarah added. "Judge Pierce has connections throughout the criminal justice system, prosecutors, defense attorneys, police officers. If he gets wind of this investigation, he'll have plenty of warning to cover his tracks or to take more direct action." The implication hung between them, unspoken but understood. Harold Demming had talked about people who disappeared. If Judge Pierce was capable of that, he was capable of anything. "We need to keep this contained," Webb said finally. "Bring in only people we trust absolutely. No paperwork, no electronic records, nothing that could be accessed by someone with the right connections. This investigation runs off the books until we have enough evidence to move." Sarah nodded. "And what about Demming? He stays in protective custody, solitary confinement for his own safety. No visitors except his lawyer, and we monitor those conversations as closely as the law allows." "What about his family?" Webb hesitated. We can't provide official protection without tipping our hand, but I'll make some calls, arrange for increased patrols in his neighborhood. If Pierce is as connected as Demming claims, we have to assume he'll know about the arrest within hours. We need to move fast. The next 48 hours were a blur of clandestine meetings and careful maneuvering. Sarah assembled a team of 4 officers she trusted implicitly. Washington, who had been with her at the checkpoint, Martinez, a young detective with a gift for financial forensics, Chen, a veteran investigator with decades of experience in organized crime, and Patterson, a former FBI agent who had joined the Atlanta PD after retirement and maintained contacts throughout the federal law enforcement community. They met in a storage room in the basement of the precinct, away from the security cameras and the curious eyes of their colleagues. Sarah laid out what they knew, what Harold had told them, and what they suspected. The reaction ranged from skepticism to outrage, but by the end of the briefing, everyone understood the stakes. If Judge Pierce is dirty, Chen said slowly, then every case he's ever touched is potentially compromised. Every conviction, every acquittal, every dismissal. We're talking about decades of jurisprudence that might have to be revisited. That's for the courts to sort out, Sarah replied. Our job is to build a case, and to do that, we need to verify Demming's claims about the Savannah shipment. If we can connect Pierce to that delivery, if we can document his involvement in real time, we'll have enough to bring federal charges. Patterson shook his head. The feds will want to be involved. This is exactly the kind of case that RICO was designed for. We can't keep them out forever. We don't have to keep them out forever, just long enough to gather the initial evidence. Once we have something concrete, we can bring in whatever agencies we need. But right now, the fewer people who know about this investigation, the better. They divided the work according to their strengths. Martinez would dig into Judge Pierce's finances, looking for anomalies that might indicate hidden income. Chen would work his contacts in the organized crime world, trying to identify the network that Demming had described. Patterson would reach out to trusted colleagues in federal law enforcement, testing the waters without revealing the specific target of their investigation. Washington would maintain surveillance on key locations, watching for unusual activity, and Sarah would follow the most dangerous lead of all. She would get closer to Judge Raymond Pierce. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. 2 days after Harold Demming's arrest, a charity gala was held at the Piedmont Driving Club, one of Atlanta's most exclusive venues. The event was a fundraiser for the Children's Legal Defense Fund, and the guest of honor was none other than Judge Raymond Pierce, who would be receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to juvenile justice. Sarah obtained an invitation through Captain Webb, who pulled strings with a deputy commissioner who owed him a favor. She spent 3 hours preparing for the event, trading her uniform for an elegant black dress that she had bought years ago for a wedding she never attended. She felt exposed without her weapon, vulnerable without the familiar weight of Max at her side. But this was reconnaissance, not confrontation. Her job was to observe, to listen, to look for any sign that the man accepting accolades for his service to children was secretly profiting from their destruction. The gala was everything she expected and nothing she wanted. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across a ballroom filled with Atlanta's elite, politicians and business people, lawyers and socialites, all dressed in their finest and competing to see who could write the largest check. Sarah moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting champagne she didn't drink and making small talk she wouldn't remember, all while keeping her eyes fixed on the man at the center of attention. Judge Raymond Pierce was 64 years old, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and a deep voice that commanded attention without effort. He moved through the gathering with the ease of someone accustomed to admiration, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with practiced grace. Nothing about his demeanor suggested guilt or fear. Nothing about his bearing indicated that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. a respected jurist being honored for a lifetime of public service. But Sarah had learned long ago that appearances were the easiest things to fake. She watched as Pierce worked the room, cataloguing his interactions, noting who he spoke with longest, who he avoided, who seemed to share some secret understanding that passed in a glance or a subtle nod. She saw him exchange words with a city councilman who had been rumored to have connections to organized crime. She watched him embrace a real estate developer whose projects had been the subject of multiple investigations, all of which had been quietly dropped. She observed him accept an envelope from a man she didn't recognize, slipping it into his jacket pocket with a casual gesture that suggested long practice. None of it was proof. All of it was suspicious. The award ceremony began at 9 o'clock, and Sarah found a position near the back of the ballroom where she could observe without being observed. The speeches were predictable, glowing tributes to Pierce's dedication, his wisdom, his compassion. Former defendants whose lives he had turned around, attorneys who praised his fairness, politicians who celebrated his commitment to justice. When Pierce took the stage to accept his award, Sarah found herself leaning forward, searching his face for some crack in the facade, some glimpse of the monster that Harold Demming had described. What she saw was a man who believed his own myth, a man who had convinced himself that whatever crimes he had committed were justified by the good he had done. A man who would look at himself in the mirror every morning and see a hero looking back. It was, she realized, the most dangerous kind of evil, the kind that didn't recognize itself as evil at all. The gala ended just before midnight, and Sarah was preparing to leave when she felt a hand on her elbow. She turned to find herself face to face with Judge Raymond Pierce himself, his silver eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Lieutenant Collins," he said, his voice warm and friendly, "I don't believe we've met, but I recognize you from the news coverage of that church bus arrest. Quite a remarkable catch." Sarah forced herself to smile. "Thank you, Your Honor. It was actually my partner who made the detection. I just followed his lead." "Ah, yes, the famous Max. I've heard stories about that dog. Quite the asset to the department." Pierce's grip on her elbow tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to communicate control. It must be fascinating work, never knowing what each day will bring, never knowing what secrets might be hiding in plain sight. Was there a threat in those words? A warning? Sarah couldn't be sure, but she felt the hair rise on the back of her neck just as it had when Max alerted on Harold Demming's bag. "Trust your instincts," she told herself. "Trust the feeling that something is very wrong." "Every day is different," she agreed carefully. "That's what keeps it interesting." "Indeed." Pierce released her elbow and took a half step back, his smile never wavering. "Well, Lieutenant, I hope our paths cross again under more pleasant circumstances. Perhaps when you're not working." "I look forward to it, Your Honor." She watched him walk away, disappearing into the crowd of well-wishers and sycophants, and she felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. Judge Raymond Pierce knew exactly who she was, and he was not the least bit concerned. That certainty followed her home and kept her awake long into the night. She lay in bed with Max curled at her feet, staring at the ceiling and turning the encounter over in her mind. Pierce had approached her deliberately. He had mentioned the church bus arrest specifically. He had made a point of letting her know that he was aware of her investigation. But why? If he was as dangerous as Demming claimed, why not simply have her removed? Why tip his hand with a cryptic conversation at a charity gala? The answer came to her just as the first grey light of dawn began to seep through her curtains. Pierce wasn't worried because he didn't believe she was a threat. He saw her as a minor nuisance, a fly buzzing around his head, something to be swatted aside when it became annoying. He had approached her at the gala not to warn her off, but to take her measure, to assess whether she was smart enough or brave enough to be dangerous. He had concluded that she was neither. That conclusion, Sarah decided as she finally drifted off to sleep, would be his first mistake. The Savannah shipment was scheduled to arrive in 18 hours, and Sarah's team was as ready as they would ever be. Martinez had uncovered a series of shell companies linked to Judge Pierce's financial holdings, hidden behind layers of offshore accounts and nominee directors. Jen's contacts had confirmed the existence of the distribution network, a sophisticated operation that used legitimate businesses as fronts and religious organizations as cover. Patterson had identified a DEA agent in Savannah who could be trusted, someone who would provide access to the port without alerting the wider law enforcement community. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. They would allow the shipment to come through the port, would track it as it moved inland toward Atlanta, and would document every step of the journey. When the drugs reached their final destination, when the money changed hands and the guilty parties revealed themselves, they would move in with overwhelming force. But first, they had to get through the next 18 hours without being discovered. Sarah left Max at home for the surveillance operation, a decision that felt like leaving part of herself behind. The dog had whined when she walked out the door, sensing that something important was happening, wanting to be part of it. But this mission required stealth and subtlety, and Max's presence would only draw attention. The team assembled at a safe house in Decatur, a nondescript ranch home that the department kept for sensitive operations. They reviewed the plan one final time, checked their equipment, and synchronized their watches. At midnight they would begin. The port of Savannah was one of the busiest in the United States, a sprawling complex of cranes and containers and cargo ships that operated around the clock. Martinez had identified the specific vessel carrying the shipment, a container ship registered in Panama that had made the crossing from Colombia in just under 2 weeks. Chen's contacts had provided the container number and its location within the vast maze of stacked metal boxes that filled the port. Sarah and Washington took the first surveillance position, a rented car parked in a lot overlooking the main access road. Patterson coordinated with the DEA agent, who had arranged for them to monitor the port's security cameras without arousing suspicion. Martinez and Chen waited at a second position along the highway, ready to follow the shipment when it began its journey north. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah watched trucks come and go, watched cranes swing containers from ships to shore, watched the constant flow of commerce that was the lifeblood of the American economy. Somewhere in that vast industrial landscape, hidden among the legitimate cargo, was a shipment worth tens of millions of dollars. And somewhere in Atlanta, a judge was waiting to receive his cut. The container was loaded onto a truck just after 4 in the morning, earlier than they had expected. Sarah reported the movement to the team and felt a surge of adrenaline as the operation shifted from waiting to action. The truck pulled out of the port and turned onto I-16, beginning the 3-hour journey toward Atlanta. They followed at a distance, switching positions every 30 minutes to avoid detection. The truck driver seemed unaware of their presence, maintaining a steady speed and making no attempt at evasive maneuvers. Either he was very confident or very careless. Sarah suspected the former. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, the truck left the interstate and turned onto a series of secondary roads that led toward the industrial district on the south side of Atlanta. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as they entered territory she recognized. Warehouses and storage facilities, many of them abandoned or underutilized, perfect for operations that required privacy. The truck stopped at a large warehouse on a dead-end street, its loading dock concealed from the main road by a high concrete wall. Sarah pulled into a parking lot across the street and killed her engine, watching as the driver climbed out of the cab and approached a door at the side of the building. "This is it," she said into her radio. "All units hold position. We wait until the handoff is complete." They didn't have to wait long. Within 15 minutes, 3 vehicles arrived at the warehouse: a black SUV with tinted windows, a white van similar to the one they had searched at the checkpoint, and a silver Mercedes that Sarah recognized immediately. She had seen that car at the Piedmont Driving Club, parked in a reserved space near the entrance. Judge Raymond Pierce had come to personally oversee his investment. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her weapon as she watched Pierce emerge from the Mercedes and walk toward the warehouse. He was dressed casually in khakis and a golf shirt, looking like a retired executive stopping by his storage unit. Nothing about his demeanor suggested that he was about to take possession of drugs worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. She keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. "All units, we have confirmation. The target is on sight. Prepare to move on my signal." The next few minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Sarah watched through her binoculars as men emerged from the warehouse and began unloading the container, transferring its contents to the waiting van. She counted the packages as they moved, each one representing misery and death on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. She watched Judge Pierce supervise the operation, pointing and directing, a conductor leading an orchestra of destruction. When the last package had been loaded and the van doors had slammed shut, Sarah gave the signal, "All units, move in, now." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Patrol cars materialized from side streets and parking lots, their sirens shattering the early morning quiet. Unmarked vehicles blocked both ends of the street, trapping the conspirators in a net of steel and flashing lights. Officers in tactical gear emerged from a nearby building where they had been waiting, their weapons drawn and ready. Sarah was out of her car before it had fully stopped, her badge held high in one hand and her service weapon in the other. "Police! Everyone on the ground! Hands where I can see them!" The scene dissolved into chaos. Men scattered in all directions, some attempting to flee, others reaching for weapons, still others freezing in place with expressions of shock and disbelief. Sarah saw the truck driver go down beneath a tackle from Officer Chen. She saw the SUV driver attempt to reverse out of the trap, only to be stopped by a spike strip that shredded his tires. And she saw Judge Raymond Pierce standing perfectly still in the middle of the pandemonium, his silver eyes fixed on her with an expression of cold fury that turned her blood to ice. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply stood there, waiting, as Sarah approached with her weapon trained on his center mass. Even now, surrounded by evidence of his crimes, about to be arrested and humiliated, he radiated an aura of authority that made her doubt her own actions. "Lieutenant Collins," he said, his voice calm and controlled, "you have no idea what you've done. Raymond Pierce, you are under arrest for drug trafficking, conspiracy, and corruption. You have the right to remain silent." Sarah recited the Miranda warnings from memory, each word feeling like a small victory against the darkness this man represented. As she fastened the handcuffs around his wrists, Pierce leaned close and whispered something that only she could hear. "This isn't over. You've taken a piece. The game continues." Sarah stepped back and signaled for Washington to take the prisoner. "Whatever games you think you're playing," she said, "they end now." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Harold Demming had described a network, an organization with tentacles reaching into every corner of the justice system. Judge Pierce was a major player, perhaps the major player in Atlanta, but he wasn't the only one. There were others out there, hidden behind their own masks of respectability, waiting to see what would happen next. The arrests at the warehouse were just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded in ways that no one had anticipated. Harold Demming, facing reduced charges in exchange for his testimony, provided a roadmap of corruption that stretched from the halls of government to the boardrooms of legitimate businesses. prosecutors, defense attorneys, police officers, politicians. The network had infiltrated every institution that was supposed to protect the public from exactly this kind of predation. Sarah and Max were at the center of it all, their partnership becoming a symbol of the department's commitment to rooting out corruption wherever it hid. The media dubbed them the Incorruptibles, a label that Sarah found embarrassing but Max seemed to accept with appropriate K-9 dignity. They appeared at press conferences and community events, reminders that there were still people willing to stand against the darkness. Judge Pierce was denied bail after prosecutors presented evidence of his flight risk and the extent of his criminal connections. He sat in a cell in the Fulton County Jail, awaiting trial on charges that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. But even from prison, he cast a long shadow. His lawyers filed motion after motion, attacking the legality of the surveillance, the credibility of the witnesses, the procedures used in the arrests. Each motion was denied, but each one cost time and resources that the department could barely spare. And then the threats began. The first one came as a letter delivered to Sarah's home address, despite the fact that her personal information was supposed to be protected. It was typed on plain white paper, unsigned, consisting of a single sentence: "Max would look good mounted on a wall." Sarah read the letter twice, then carefully placed it in an evidence bag and drove to the precinct. Captain Webb met her in his office, his face grave as he examined the threat. "We'll increase patrols around your home," he said, "and I want you to consider staying somewhere else until we identify who sent this. I'm not running from some coward who writes anonymous letters. This isn't about running. It's about being smart. Pierce has connections we still haven't fully mapped. If he ordered this threat, he can order worse." Sarah thought about the look in Pierce's eyes when she had arrested him, the cold fury that had promised retribution. She thought about Harold Demming's warning that people who tried to get out of the network simply disappeared. She thought about the men who had been willing to kill to protect their profits, and she knew that Webb was right. But she also knew that she couldn't let them win, that running, hiding, showing fear would only embolden the people who had sent the threat. They wanted her to be afraid. They wanted her to question her choices, to regret her actions, to wish she had looked the other way when Max alerted on that church bus. "I'll take precautions," she said finally, "but I'm not disappearing. Not now. Not when we're so close to putting Pierce away for good." Webb studied her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been admiration or might have been concern. Probably it was both. Then he nodded slowly and picked up his phone. "I'll make some calls. We'll set up surveillance on your residence, put some plainclothes units in the neighborhood. And Sarah? Yes? Watch your back. And watch Max's back too. That dog is worth more to this department than any 10 officers I could name." Sarah smiled despite herself. "Don't let him hear you say that. His ego's big enough already." The trial of Judge Raymond Pierce began on a crisp October morning, 6 weeks after his arrest at the warehouse. The courtroom was packed with journalists and spectators, all eager to witness the downfall of one of Atlanta's most respected jurists. Sarah sat in the front row, Max lying quietly at her feet, serving as a visual reminder of how this case had begun. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented financial records showing millions of dollars flowing through Pierce's shell companies. They played recordings of conversations in which Pierce discussed shipments and payments with known drug traffickers. They called witness after witness who testified to the judge's involvement in the network, including Harold Demming, who took the stand and detailed his own crimes while implicating his former mentor. Pierce's defense team fought back with everything they had, attacking the credibility of the witnesses, challenging the legality of the evidence, painting their client as the victim of a vast conspiracy orchestrated by criminals seeking to avoid justice. But the weight of the evidence was simply too great, and even the most skilled attorneys could not make it disappear. On the 8th day of the trial, as Sarah was leaving the courthouse for a lunch break, she noticed a man watching her from across the plaza. He was unremarkable in appearance, medium height, brown hair, forgettable features, but something about his stillness drew her attention. He stood perfectly motionless while the crowds flowed around him, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Max noticed him too. The dog's ears went flat against his skull, and a low growl rumbled in his throat, the same warning sound he had made when he detected the cocaine in Harold Demming's bag. Sarah reached down to grip his collar, her other hand moving toward the weapon at her hip. "Easy," she murmured, "easy." The man held her gaze for a long moment, then smiled, a cold, mirthless expression that conveyed no warmth. He raised his hand in a mock salute, turned, and disappeared into the lunchtime crowd. Sarah stood frozen in place, her heart pounding, her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. That had been a message, a demonstration, proof that Pierce's people could get close to her whenever they wanted, could watch her, could reach out and touch her if they chose. But they hadn't touched her, not yet, which meant they were waiting for something, building towards something, planning something that required patience and timing and an opportunity that hadn't yet presented itself. She pulled out her phone and called Captain Webb, keeping her voice low and calm, despite the fear that was clawing at her chest. "We have a problem." The department's response was immediate and comprehensive. Sarah was assigned a protective detail, 2 officers who would accompany her everywhere she went. Her home was equipped with additional security measures, cameras and alarms and panic buttons connected directly to the precinct. Max was never to leave her side, not just as a partner, but as a protector. The trial continued, but now Sarah watched every face in the crowd, every movement in the gallery, every vehicle that passed too slowly on the street outside. She saw threats everywhere, in the delivery man who lingered too long at the courthouse door, in the journalist who asked questions that seemed just a little too pointed, in the spectator who met her eyes for a second too long before looking away. 3 weeks into the trial, the jury began its deliberations. Sarah waited in the courthouse, surrounded by her protective detail, feeling like a prisoner in the building where she had come to seek justice. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each tick of the clock marking another moment of uncertainty. The verdict came just before 5 in the afternoon, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in noise, journalists shouting questions, spectators applauding or weeping, Pierce's lawyers demanding an immediate appeal. Sarah sat perfectly still through all of it, her hand resting on Max's head, feeling the tension slowly drain from her body. It was over. The monster was going to prison, where he would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. But as she watched Pierce being led from the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned and looked directly at her. His face was expressionless, but his eyes blazed with a hatred so intense that it seemed to have physical weight. He didn't speak, didn't need to speak. The message was clear. This isn't over. The message came 3 days later. Sarah was leaving the precinct after a late shift, walking to her car in the underground parking garage with Max at her side and one of her protective detail officers a few steps behind. The garage was quiet, most of the day shift personnel having already gone home, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. She was reaching for her car door when Max suddenly lunged forward, straining against his lead with a force that nearly pulled her off her feet. She had seen him react like this before, at the checkpoint when he detected the cocaine. But this was different. This was more intense, more urgent, more primal. This was Max telling her that something was very, very wrong. "Collins, get down!" The shout came from her protective detail officer, followed immediately by a sound that Sarah knew all too well, the flat crack of a gunshot echoing through the enclosed space. She threw herself to the ground, pulling Max down with her. As more shots rang out from somewhere behind a row of parked vehicles, the next few seconds were chaos. She heard her officer returning fire, heard running footsteps, heard the squeal of tires as a vehicle accelerated toward the exit. She crawled behind her car, keeping Max pressed to her side, her weapon drawn and ready but with no target to aim at. Then silence. Terrible. Ringing silence broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant wail of approaching sirens. When Sarah finally rose from behind her car, she saw her protective detail officer sprawled on the concrete floor, blood pooling beneath his body. She rushed to his side, pressed her hands to the wound in his chest, screamed for help that was already on its way, but might not arrive in time. Officer David Nakamura died in the ambulance en route to the hospital. He was 34 years old, married, father of 2 young daughters. He had been assigned to Sarah's protective detail because he was one of the best marksmen in the department. None of that had mattered when the bullets started flying. The shooting was the top story on every news channel that night, and by morning it had become a national sensation. A police officer assassinated in the parking garage of his own precinct. A brazen attack that demonstrated the reach and ruthlessness of the criminal organization that Judge Pierce had led. A message to anyone who might consider following in Sarah Collins's footsteps. Captain Webb pulled Sarah from active duty, citing concerns for her safety. She fought the decision with every argument she could muster, but he was immovable. "This isn't punishment," he told her. "This is protection. Pierce's people have shown they're willing to kill to get to you. Until we neutralize the threat, you stay out of the line of fire." So Sarah stayed home, surrounded by security, watching the investigation unfold on television while Max paced restlessly from room to room. The shooter had escaped, leaving behind nothing but shell casings and a stolen car that had been abandoned 3 miles from the precinct. The motive was obvious, the method professional, the message unmistakable. But something about the attack bothered Sarah. It nagged at her mind like a splinter beneath the skin, irritating and impossible to ignore. The shooter had been close enough to hit his target accurately, but he had chosen to aim at Officer Nakamura rather than at Sarah herself. If the goal was to silence her, to eliminate the witness whose testimony had helped convict Judge Pierce, why not take the cleaner shot? Unless silencing her wasn't the goal, the realization hit her like a physical blow, and she sat up straight on her couch, startling Max from the light doze he had settled into. They didn't want to kill her. They wanted to isolate her, to remove her from the investigation, to sideline her while they cleaned up whatever loose ends remained. By killing Nakamura, they had accomplished exactly that. Sarah was now effectively neutralized, imprisoned in her own home by the very people sworn to protect her. She reached for her phone and called Captain Webb, explaining her theory in rapid, urgent sentences. Webb listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You might be right," he said finally, "which means we need to figure out what they're trying to hide, what they're so desperate to protect that they were willing to kill a cop to keep you away from it. It has to be connected to the network, something Demming didn't tell us, or something he didn't know himself. Pierce was the head of the operation in Atlanta, but there has to be more. Suppliers, distributors, customers, someone further up the chain who's still out there. I'll put Martinez and Chen on it, see what they can dig up. I should be working on this too. You should be staying alive." Webb's voice softened slightly. "I know this is hard. I know you want to be in the middle of it. But right now, the best thing you can do is stay safe and let us do our jobs." Sarah ended the call and sat in the gathering darkness of her living room, Max's warm weight pressing against her legs. She understood Webb's reasoning. She even agreed with it in the abstract. But she had never been good at sitting on the sidelines, at watching others fight battles she had started. It went against every instinct she possessed. Max lifted his head and looked at her, his amber eyes reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights outside her window. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from the simple act of connection. "We're not done yet," she told him. "Not by a long shot." The break came from an unexpected direction. 2 weeks after the shooting, Sarah received a visitor at her safe house, a woman she had never met, a woman who introduced herself as Monica Vance and claimed to have information about the network that had tried to kill her. She was perhaps 40 years old, with greying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness. She had been Judge Pierce's personal assistant for 7 years. She had access to files that no one else had seen, and she was ready to talk. Sarah listened as Monica laid out a story that made everything they had uncovered so far seem like the tip of an iceberg. The network didn't just operate in Atlanta. It stretched across the entire Southeast, with connections to cartels in Mexico and Colombia, to distribution networks in major cities throughout the region, to legitimate businesses that laundered money by the millions. Judge Pierce had been a key player, but he was not the leader. He took orders from someone else, someone whose identity was known only to a handful of the most trusted insiders, someone named Constantine. "I don't know who Constantine is," Monica admitted. "I've never seen him, never heard his voice, but I've seen the communications, the orders that came down from above, the instructions that Pierce followed without question. Constantine runs everything. The drugs, the money, the corruption, all of it flows through him. Where are these communications now? Hidden. I kept copies of everything, insurance, in case I ever needed to protect myself. They're stored in a safety deposit box at a bank downtown. I can take you there, show you everything." Sarah felt the familiar quickening of her pulse, the hunter's instinct that told her she was close to something important. Why come forward now? Why risk yourself? Monica's eyes filled with tears. "Because David Nakamura had children. Because I couldn't pretend anymore that I wasn't part of this. Because some things are more important than staying safe." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding in a way that went beyond words. She had felt that same conviction herself on a hot August morning when Max had alerted on a church bus and set all of this in motion. Some things were more important than safety. Some things had to be done, regardless of the cost. She called Captain Webb and arranged for a team to meet them at the bank. The safety deposit box contained exactly what Monica had promised: years of communications, financial records, photographs and documents that laid bare the inner workings of the criminal empire that had corrupted so many. And buried among those records was a single piece of information that made everything else pale in comparison. Constantine was not a person. Constantine was a code name used by a rotating group of leaders, individuals who passed the mantle from one to another to avoid detection. The current Constantine, the one who had ordered Pierce's protection of the network and Nakamura's assassination, was someone Sarah knew. Someone she had trusted. Deputy Commissioner Robert Langford stood at the top of the department's chain of command, a second only to the commissioner himself. He had been a cop for 35 years, rising through the ranks with a reputation for integrity and dedication. He had personally approved the resources for Sarah's investigation. He had attended Officer Nakamura's funeral and delivered a eulogy that brought hardened officers to tears. And for the past decade, he'd been running the largest drug trafficking operation in the southeastern United States. The arrest of Deputy Commissioner Langford was conducted with military precision. Sarah was not present, still officially on administrative leave, but she watched the video footage that emerged within hours of the operation. She saw Langford being led from his office in handcuffs, his face a mask of controlled fury that reminded her uncomfortably of Judge Pierce. She saw the stacks of evidence being carried out of his home, documents and computers, and a safe full of cash that would take forensic accountants weeks to fully process. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel vindication. She felt only a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to seep into every cell of her body. She had set out to catch a drug dealer on a church bus and had ended up exposing corruption at the highest levels of her own department. It was a victory, she supposed, but it didn't feel like one. Max seemed to sense her mood, pressing close to her side as she sat on the couch and watched the news coverage. She wrapped her arm around his neck and buried her face in his fur, drawing strength from his presence, as she had done so many times before. The call from Captain Webb came just as the evening news was ending. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I've been better." "I know. Listen, the Commissioner wants to see you tomorrow morning. He's putting together a task force to clean up the mess that Langford left behind, and he wants you to lead it." Sarah was silent for a long moment, processing the implications of the offer. Leading a task force meant returning to active duty. It meant putting herself back in the line of fire, back in the crosshairs of whatever remnants of the network might still be operational. It meant accepting responsibility for uncovering secrets that powerful people wanted to stay buried. "What do you think?" she asked finally. "I think you're the only person for the job. I think you've proven yourself in ways that most officers never get the chance to. And I think that dog of yours is going to drive you crazy if you have to stay cooped up in that safe house much longer." Sarah looked at Max, who was watching her with the patient intensity that she had come to know so well. He thumped his tail against the cushions, and she could almost swear he was smiling. "Tell the Commissioner I'll be there at 8. The task force worked for 6 months, systematically dismantling what remained of the Constantine network. They made arrests across 7 states. Seized assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and built cases against corrupt officials at every level of government. Judge Pierce and Deputy Commissioner Langford both received life sentences, their trials becoming national spectacles that exposed the rot at the heart of American institutions. Monica Vance testified at both trials and was placed in witness protection afterward. Harold Demming received a reduced sentence for his cooperation and was sent to a minimum security facility in another state. The church bus driver, who turned out to be an innocent dupe with no knowledge of what he was carrying, was released without charges. And Sarah Collins became something she had never sought to be, a symbol. The media loved the story of the female lieutenant and her K-9 partner who had taken down a criminal empire that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. She was interviewed on national television, profiled in magazines, invited to speak at conferences and training academies. Through it all, she maintained the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her entire career. She deflected praise onto her colleagues, credited Max with the initial detection that had started everything, insisted that she was just doing her job. But she knew the truth. She knew that there had been moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments when she had wondered if the cost was worth the result. She knew that she had lost sleep and gained nightmares, that she had watched a good man die and wondered if his blood was on her hands. She knew that the victory had come at a price that could not be calculated in dollars or headlines. On the first anniversary of the church bus arrest, Sarah drove out to Stone Mountain Park, the destination that Harold Demming's congregation had never reached. She parked in the main lot and walked to an overlook that provided a sweeping view of the Atlanta skyline, Max padding silently at her side. The sun was setting behind the towers of downtown, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed too beautiful for a world that contained so much darkness. She thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this case, the officers who had risked everything to bring down the network, the families who had lost loved ones to drugs that Constantine had poured into their communities, the citizens who had placed their trust in a justice system that had been corrupted from within. She thought about Judge Pierce and Deputy Commissioner Langford sitting in their cells, stripped of the power and prestige they had accumulated over decades of criminal enterprise. She wondered if they felt remorse for what they had done, or if they still believed their own rationalizations. She thought about Officer David Nakamura, whose daughters would grow up without a father because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, protecting a colleague who had started a war she didn't fully understand. And she thought about Max, who had done nothing more than follow his training, who had frozen at the scent of cocaine in a luggage compartment and set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. He sat beside her now, his eyes scanning the horizon for threats that might or might not be there, his loyalty unwavering despite everything they had been through. "Good boy," she said softly, reaching down to stroke his fur. "Good boy." The words were inadequate, as words so often were. But Max seemed to understand. He pressed his head against her leg and let out a contented sigh, and for a moment in the fading light of a Georgia sunset, the weight of the past year seemed to lift just slightly from Sarah's shoulders. Tomorrow there would be new cases, new challenges, new threats to face. The world would continue to produce criminals and corruption, would continue to test the boundaries of justice and morality. Sarah would continue to do her job, to protect and serve, to stand against the darkness with whatever tools she had available. But tonight she would simply sit with her partner and watch the sun go down. Tonight she would allow herself to feel something like peace. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the precinct to find a new case waiting on her desk. A suspicious package had been reported at a downtown office building, and the bomb squad wanted a K-9 unit to perform a secondary sweep. It was routine work, the kind of assignment she had handled hundreds of times before the church bus case had changed everything. She clipped Max's lead to his collar and headed for the door. "Ready to go to work, partner?" Max's tail wagged once, sharply, and his ears came forward. He was always ready. They walked out together into the bright Atlanta morning, Lieutenant and K-9, partners in a profession that demanded everything and offered no guarantees. Behind them, the precinct hummed with the activity of a new day, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, officers preparing to face whatever challenges awaited them. Ahead of them lay a city of 5 million people, each one a potential victim, each one a potential threat, each one deserving of protection under a law that Sarah had sworn to uphold. She had seen the worst that human beings could do to each other, had looked into the eyes of monsters who wore the masks of respectable citizens. She had learned that corruption could hide anywhere, could infect any institution, could turn trusted allies into deadly enemies. But she had also learned something else. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. She had learned that integrity could not be compromised without consequence, that the truth had a way of emerging no matter how deeply it was buried. She had learned that one person, one dog, one moment of alertness could make a difference that rippled outward in ways impossible to predict. As she opened the door of her cruiser and watched Max leap into the back seat, Sarah Collins felt something settle into place within her. Not peace exactly, but purpose. Not certainty, but resolve. The city was waiting. The work was never done, and she was exactly where she needed to be.